J'ai fait ce cauchemar récurrent pendant très longtemps. Dans ce rêve, je quitte la maison en courant, en sachant qu'il y a quelqu'un à mes trousses. Il a un fusil. Les balles frôlent ma tête. Et je continue à courir. Je me retourne et là je vois que c'est Randy. Parfois, je me réveillais en criant. Je faisais ce cauchemar toutes les nuits. Oh là là, quelle beauté. Comment quelqu'un peut-il s'en prendre à une personne aussi belle? C'est un monstre. Je suis navrée que ça lui soit arrivé, à elle. Je suis désolée qu'elle ait dû vivre la même chose que moi. C'était un piège, et on est toutes les deux tombées dedans. La seule différence, c'est que je m'en suis sortie, et pas elle. Je suis désolée, ma pauvre. Vraiment désolée. J'ai rencontré Randy dans l'église que je fréquentais. Au tout premier abord, j'ai eu l'impression que c'était une bonne personne. Il était toujours gentil, joyeux, souriant, beau et grand. Un jour, je suis arrivée plus tôt. Je me suis assise à côté de lui. C'est là que notre relation a commencé. Quand j'ai commencé à fréquenter Randy Gay, je ne cherchais pas à être en couple. C'est arrivé comme ça. On s'aimait bien. C'était apparemment une personne en qui je pouvais avoir confiance. Il me traitait comme une reine. Je crois que Randy avait déjà été marié par le passé, mais je ne me suis pas attardée sur le sujet. J'avais entendu dire que Randy avait un casier judiciaire et qu'il était assez lourd. Mais j'ai confiance en Dieu. Et je crois que tout le monde mérite une seconde chance. Le passé, c'est le passé. On oublie.
Alors, on dîne ensemble?
Je pensais avoir trouvé mon partenaire, que c'était mon âme sœur. Je me suis trompée. Plus j'y repense, plus c'est évident. Randy s'est servi de moi et il s'est joué de moi. Et je pense que ça le rendait heureux parce que j'entrais dans son petit jeu. Un soir, on était en train de parler. Simplement. Je l'ai alors questionné sur son passé. Il m'a dit, « Tu es sûr de vouloir le savoir ?»
Ça pourrait changer ton regard sur moi.
Et j'ai dit, « Oui, vraiment ?» Et il a dit, « Comme tu voudras. » Il m'a expliqué qu'un jour, son père s'était montré violent avec la femme que Randy fréquentait. Et que ça avait dégénéré et que Randy avait abattu son père pour la protéger.
J'ai pris le fusil et je l'ai tué.
Quand il m'a raconté ça, j'ai eu peur. C'est pas vrai. Jusque-là, je n'avais jamais vu son côté sombre. J'étais troublée.
J'ai dû purger une lourde peine.
J'étais très choquée d'apprendre que Randy était capable de faire ça. Lui, l'homme gentil et aimant que je connaissais ou que je croyais connaître. Il avait écopé de 20 ans de prison, mais il était sorti pour bonne conduite. Il a dû penser que j'allais le quitter, mais je ne l'ai pas fait. J'apprécie que tu me dises la vérité. J'ai été touchée par sa vulnérabilité et son honnêteté. Il m'a dit qu'il essayait de changer de vie. Et je l'ai cru. À mes yeux, Dieu ne l'avait pas placé sur ma route par hasard. Comme je l'ai dit, tout le monde mérite une seconde chance. Alors je lui en ai donné une. Mais je ne savais pas tout. Quand on s'est mariés, je pensais que le passé était le passé pour nous deux. J'avais foi en l'avenir. Je pensais que ma vie allait être parfaite. C'était faux. Randy et moi sommes allés chez un ami à lui. En fait, c'était son meilleur ami. La soirée se déroulait normalement. Tout allait bien. Et puis, des mots ont été prononcés qui n'ont pas plu à Randy. Et la réaction de Randy a été de lui donner un coup de poing. Et là, c'était parti. Je n'ai vu que de la rage. Ses yeux avaient changé. Son visage avait changé. Son attitude avait complètement changé.
Les gars, arrêtez!
C'était un choc pour moi. Je criais, je pleurais et je leur disais à tous les deux d'arrêter. Randy, arrête! Randy! Il m'a regardé avec des poignards et du feu dans les yeux. J'étais terrifiée. Quand la bagarre s'est terminée, son ami était amoché. Randy lui avait certainement cassé le nez. Et du sang coulait sur le côté de son visage. Randy avait des égratignures, des bleus et des vêtements déchirés. J'étais effrayée par ce que je venais de voir. Je n'avais jamais vu Randy agir de la sorte. Qu'est-ce qui t'a pris? Le voir avec une telle rage en lui et s'acharner sur son meilleur ami, ça m'a fait peur. S'il était capable de faire ça à son meilleur ami, qu'est-ce qu'il pouvait me faire à moi? Et les mots « je ne recommencerai jamais », j'ai appris que c'est un mensonge. Ça revient toujours. J'aurais aimé voir plutôt le diable en lui. Au tout début de notre relation, Randy m'avait dit qu'il était un ancien alcoolique. Je me suis dit, d'accord. Et comme il semblait rester sobre, Ça ne m'a pas dérangée. Un jour, alors qu'on était chez ses amis, ils avaient tous un verre à la main et ils étaient là à lui dire « Allez, un petit verre ne te fera pas de mal !»
C'est juste une bière. Allez.
Et il a fini par accepter la bière.
Voilà, mon pote.
Quand il l'a porté à ses lèvres, j'ai dit « Tu ne devrais pas faire ça. Tu n'as pas bu depuis plus de 10 ans. Pourquoi maintenant? Randy, qu'est-ce que tu fais ?» Mais il ne m'a pas écouté. J'étais très déçue. Je me trouvais dans la cuisine et quand il est arrivé, je lui ai demandé pourquoi il buvait à nouveau. « Tu vas bien ?» Et cette question l'a mis en colère. Je fais ce que je veux, bon sang. Et tu ne peux pas m'en empêcher. Il n'a pas haussé le ton, mais c'était la première fois qu'il me parlait comme ça. Comme il ne m'avait jamais parlé de cette façon, je me suis dit, c'est pas vrai. Vraiment? Ça ne me semble pas. Il y a un problème. Dès qu'on a franchi le seuil, son comportement a changé. L'expression sur son visage a changé. J'ai senti à quel point il était furieux, à son regard et au ton de sa voix.
Je ne veux pas entendre ça.
Et il s'est mis à me hurler dessus et à m'interdire de m'opposer à lui. Puis il a levé les mains et m'a poussée. J'ai décollé pour atterrir sur le dossier du canapé. Je n'en croyais pas mes yeux. Et un sourire est apparu sur son visage. C'était effrayant. Je me suis levée. J'ai couru dans le couloir et il m'a propulsée contre les murs. Tout le long du couloir. « Laisse-moi, Randy !» En larmes, je criais « Ne fais pas ça, tu me fais mal, arrête !» Notre chambre était au bout du couloir. J'ai réussi à verrouiller la porte. Il frappait à la porte. « Laisse-moi entrer! Laisse-moi entrer !»
Ouvre la porte, tout de suite! Ouvre-moi cette porte, sinon ça va mal se passer!
J'avais peur. Si tu n'ouvres pas cette porte, je vais la défoncer. Il ne l'a pas fait. Il est allé dans la salle de bain pour vomir. Puis il s'est allongé sur le canapé et il s'est endormi. J'avais l'espoir que... Je me disais, ok, c'est peut-être un acte isolé, il ne le refera peut-être plus. J'aurais dû essayer de m'enfuir. J'aurais dû le quitter. J'aurais dû faire plein de choses que je n'ai pas faites. Je voulais croire que c'était une bonne personne parce que je l'aimais. J'étais amoureuse de lui. Jusqu'à la fin, j'ai cru que je pouvais le changer. Mais j'avais tort. À l'église, je me sentais en sécurité. Ça me rassurait d'être entourée d'autres personnes. Bien sûr, il y avait des hématomes sous mes manches, mais aussi sur mes jambes. Randy veillait à ce que ça reste caché, pour que personne ne les voie et m'interroge. Je me souviens de la sensation de ces bleus. Je me souviens que je m'efforçais de sourire malgré la douleur atroce. Parce que j'étais gênée. Je ne voulais pas qu'on sache que j'étais une femme battue. J'avais honte. Pour les gens qui se demandent pourquoi je suis restée, s'ils n'ont pas connu ça, ils ne peuvent pas comprendre. Dans cette période sombre, j'ai souvent demandé à Dieu de m'aider et de me guider dans cette épreuve. Je lui ai dit que j'avais besoin de réponses pour savoir quoi faire. J'ai continué à me rendre à l'église, contrairement à Randy. J'ai enfin commencé à me sentir plus libre. J'ai commencé à me sentir un peu moins sous pression, un peu moins stressée. J'ai tissé des liens avec un homme et son épouse. Ça a été ma meilleure amie. Je pouvais lui parler de tout. C'étaient des gens merveilleux. J'ai commencé à me confier à elle, je dirais, entre 6 mois et 1 an après avoir fait leur connaissance. Cette amitié m'a offert une nouvelle chance de pouvoir faire confiance à quelqu'un. J'ai alors pris mon courage à 2 mains et je lui ai montré mes bleus. J'ai quelque chose à te montrer. Tes bras. Elle m'a dit, tu ne mérites pas ça. Tu dois le quitter et tu dois le faire vite. Je l'ai regardé et j'ai dit, c'est vrai, tu as raison. Je ne voulais plus être maltraitée. Je ne voulais plus souffrir. Je savais que je devais partir. Mais que ce ne serait pas facile. Tout le monde est en mesure de reprendre le chemin de l'Église pour devenir une meilleure personne et y mettre tout son cœur. Randy ne l'a pas fait. Il a choisi de ne pas retourner à l'église. Il a choisi de ne pas devenir meilleur. Un soir, alors qu'on dînait dans la cuisine, il m'a dit qu'il voulait me révéler quelque chose.
Il faut que tu saches un truc. Mon père n'est pas le seul homme que j'ai tué.
Il n'a pas précisé quand il avait tué cet autre homme, ni pourquoi il l'avait tué. Il ne m'a pas dévoilé son nom. Il m'a juste dit qu'il avait tué quelqu'un d'autre. Il n'a affiché aucun remords. Randy a refusé de répondre à mes questions. Rien. Il ne m'a rien dit. J'étais profondément choquée. Je crois qu'il a fait ça pour m'effrayer, pour que je reste dans le droit chemin, pour me montrer qu'il avait la situation bien en main et que j'étais toujours sous son emprise. Et que si j'essayais de partir, je serais sa troisième victime. J'aimerais savoir qui était cet homme. J'ignore même d'où il était. Je ne sais rien de lui. Alors si je pouvais trouver des informations ou quelqu'un qui sait des choses sur lui, ça m'aiderait à tourner la page.
Sa première victime était James Kelly. C'était son nom. Randy a prétendu que c'était de la légitime défense. Et au moment des faits, c'était son beau-père.
Il a donc abattu son beau-père, puis son père. Qu'est-ce qui lui est passé par la tête? Plus sadique que ça ne doit pas exister. Ça me rend tellement furieuse de savoir que les deux hommes qu'il a tués étaient des membres de sa famille. Ça me confirme maintenant qu'il aurait pu me tuer n'importe quand. Sauf qu'à l'époque, je l'ignorais. Je ne comprends pas comment j'ai pu être si bête. Et comment ai-je pu ne pas le cerner? Je craignais que si j'essayais de partir, il me fasse vraiment du mal. J'avais peur qu'il me tue. C'était le genre de personne capable de me traquer. Il aurait pu me retrouver n'importe où. Combien de nuits je me suis endormie en pleurant et en me demandant si j'allais survivre jusqu'au matin. Parce que je ne savais pas si au moment de se coucher, il allait me tuer ou si je me réveillerais le lendemain matin. Un jour, lors d'une discussion avec ma meilleure amie, je lui ai expliqué ce qui se passait. Elle m'a dit, « Debra, ça suffit comme ça, tu as trop souffert. » Puis elle a ajouté, « Debra, tu dois partir. On peut t'héberger quelques jours. » Et j'ai dit d'accord. À ce moment-là, je me suis retournée et Randy était là. Je te laisse. Il a fermé la porte derrière lui et j'ai su qu'il était en colère. J'ai vu l'expression sur son visage. J'étais debout, figée par la peur. Et il a commencé à me crier dessus.
Depuis quand tu racontes à tout le monde nos affaires personnelles?
Personne n'était censé savoir ce qu'il se passait derrière nos murs. Personne. Mais dès qu'il s'est mis à me crier dessus, mon corps s'est crispé et j'ai dit « Ça suffit. » Stop! J'ai commencé à crier moi aussi. J'ai dit « C'est pas ma faute, je ne suis pas responsable de tout ça, c'est toi. » J'étais fière de moi. Je ne m'étais jamais opposée à lui de cette façon. C'est là qu'il m'a dit « Arrête, tu n'iras nulle part ». Il n'était jamais parti en pleine dispute. J'ai eu peur parce que je ne savais pas ce qu'il allait faire. Il est revenu avec un fusil de chasse qu'il a pointé à bout portant sur mon front. C'est terrifiant de fixer le canon d'un fusil de chasse parce qu'on ne sait pas s'il va appuyer sur la détente. Je savais qu'il avait déjà tué 2 personnes par le passé. Il n'était donc plus à sa près. Et j'étais si terrifiée que je ne pouvais plus bouger. Je l'ai supplié de ne pas me tuer. Je pleurais.
Randy, pitié!
Je braillais littéralement parce que je ne voulais pas mourir. Je l'ai supplié et imploré. Ne tire pas, ne tire pas. Je ne recommencerai pas. Pitié, ne me tue pas. Ça m'a semblé durer des heures. Quand il a baissé son arme et qu'il s'est éloigné, j'ai ressenti toutes sortes d'émotions. Colère, tristesse, terreur. Toutes ces émotions me sont passées par la tête. Je ne pensais qu'à une chose, fuir. J'ai l'impression qu'il se nourrissait de ma peur et de ma colère. Il pouvait me tuer à tout moment. J'aurais aimé appeler la police. Vraiment. J'aurais aimé ne pas avoir aussi peur et ne pas avoir aussi honte. Parce que je sais maintenant que la police est là pour ça. Pour protéger les victimes d'abus. Ma confiance dans l'être humain s'était évaporée. Je n'avais plus confiance en personne à part ma meilleure amie. Si jamais quelqu'un d'autre m'avait conseillé de le quitter, j'aurais dit « Non, non, j'ai peur ». Ça s'accumulait à l'intérieur pendant un long moment. Et dès que j'étais seule, je craquais souvent. Je fondais en larmes et j'attrapais mon oreiller et je le serrais très fort. Ou j'appelais ma meilleure amie pour lui parler. Je n'ai jamais songé à consulter parce que j'avais ma meilleure amie. Elle m'a guidée pendant cette épreuve. Elle m'a aidée à m'en sortir. Elle m'a fait sentir que j'étais un être humain, que j'étais une belle personne, à l'intérieur comme à l'extérieur. Tout le monde voit chaque être humain différemment. C'est très difficile. Très, très difficile de quitter son bourreau. Parce qu'on ne sait jamais quand il va surgir. On ne sait jamais ce que les gens vont lui dire, si c'est vrai ou non. On ne sait jamais où il va apparaître, s'il va venir sur notre lieu de travail. On a beau essayer de se cacher, il finira par nous retrouver. J'ai fait semblant de dormir, mais je ne dormais pas. J'ai fait semblant jusqu'à ce que Randy parte au travail. Dès que j'ai entendu sa voiture partir, je me suis levée et j'ai mis mon plan en action. J'ai fait le plus vite possible. Chaque fois que j'entendais un véhicule qui s'approchait de la maison, j'étais terrifiée. Je crois que s'il était rentré et qu'il m'avait vu en train de faire mes valises, il m'aurait tuée. Il savait que mes parents vivaient dans l'Oregon, mais il n'a jamais su où. Quand j'ai appelé mes parents et que je leur ai expliqué ce qu'il s'était passé, ce que je faisais, ils m'ont dit « Debra, sors vite de là et viens à la maison ». Quand j'ai quitté l'Arkansas, j'ai senti la tension s'envoler. J'arrivais de nouveau à respirer. J'ai réussi à me détendre un peu. Je me sentais en sécurité. Je n'ai parlé de mon départ qu'à une seule personne, ma meilleure amie. Et elle était fière de moi. Elle m'a dit « Je suis contente que tu partes. Tu vas me manquer. » J'ai décidé de demander le divorce. Mais pour ça, je devais retourner en Arkansas et lui faire face. Je voulais lui signifier moi-même la demande pour me prouver que j'en étais capable et que je ne devais plus avoir peur de lui. J'ai rassemblé tous les papiers et j'ai pris une grande inspiration pour évacuer. Puis je me suis approchée de la porte. Randy ignorait tout de ma venue. Je ne savais pas quelle serait sa réaction. Mais je n'avais plus peur. J'étais prête. J'étais prête. Quand j'ai frappé à la porte et que Randy l'a ouverte, il m'a regardée avec un air très surpris. Je pense qu'il espérait que j'étais de retour et que tout allait rentrer dans l'ordre jusqu'à ce que je sorte les papiers du divorce. C'est fini. Je lui ai tendu les documents et un stylo et j'ai dit « Signe ça. Signe ça tout de suite. » Je crois qu'il a été très surpris et qu'il a compris que j'avais changé. Qu'il n'avait plus d'emprise sur moi. Quand il a signé les papiers, j'étais heureuse. Je l'ai regardé droit dans les yeux et j'ai dit « C'est fini, terminé. Tu ne me toucheras plus jamais. » J'ai tourné les talons et je suis partie. 30 jours plus tard, j'étais divorcée. J'avais repris mon nom de jeune fille. J'en avais fini avec lui. Je pouvais vivre ma vie comme j'aurais dû la vivre dès le début, heureuse. Le policier a dit qu'il voulait me parler de Randy Gay. J'ai répondu, Randy et moi sommes divorcés, je ne veux plus rien avoir à faire avec lui. Il ne fait plus partie de ma vie. Alors, le policier m'a dit que Randy Gay avait tué une femme. Quand j'ai appris que Randy avait abattu une certaine Connie, j'ai ressenti de la colère et de la tristesse. Mais ça ne m'a pas surprise. Ça aurait pu être moi. Oh, vous plaisantez. C'est Randy à côté d'un policier. Il ne devrait jamais sourire comme ça. Il sourit comme s'il était fier de ce qu'il a fait. Il n'y a aucun remords sur ce visage. Randy semble être fier d'avoir tué Connie et heureux de l'avoir fait. Il n'a pas l'air d'avoir honte de quoi que ce soit. Et ses yeux rient. Vraiment. Ça aussi, ça me met hors de moi. Randy est un monstre, dans tous les sens du terme. Il tue quelqu'un et ça le fait sourire. Seul un monstre est capable de ça.
En mai 2011, les enquêteurs ont découvert un corps dans la forêt nationale de Ouachita, à Hot Springs. La victime, abattue d'une balle en plein visage puis ligotée dans du plastique, s'appelait Connie Snow.
Il n'a même pas eu la décence de l'enterrer. Quel genre de personne peut faire une chose pareille? Au début de notre relation, je n'ai pas perçu toute la méchanceté qu'il avait en lui. Je ne l'ai pas vu. Je ne pensais pas que c'était un être aussi mauvais. Pour moi, c'est le diable. Il est égoïste, arrogant, un sale type qu'il faut détruire parce qu'il a détruit tant de familles. Il a détruit et broyé tant de cœurs. Randy a fait bien plus de victimes que les 3 qu'il a tués. dans le couloir de la mort. Et je le serai encore plus quand le jour de son exécution arrivera. La seule façon pour moi de tourner la page, c'est de savoir qu'il est 6 pieds sous terre. J'ai eu beaucoup de mal à me sentir heureuse après ça, tellement il m'a fait souffrir. Même si les bleus étaient partis, j'avais toujours cette douleur à l'intérieur de mon cœur. Elle ne disparaissait pas. Randy a volé mon innocence, ainsi que ma foi en l'être humain. J'ai perdu cette foi parce que je ne pouvais plus me fier à personne. C'était effrayant. J'ai su, au plus profond de moi, que je ne laisserai plus jamais un homme me traiter comme ça. Jamais. Je mérite mieux que ça. Je vaux mieux que ça. Pour la première fois de ma vie, c'était formidable de prendre mes propres décisions pour moi-même. J'ai eu l'impression d'être une nouvelle personne, capable de sourire et de rire, capable de laisser la peur derrière moi. Elle est partie, lui aussi. Je n'ai plus à m'en soucier. Je suis aujourd'hui très heureuse. J'ai trouvé un homme bien qui me traite avec respect et décence. On est mariés depuis 2008. Et il m'a soutenue moralement parce qu'il sait tout ce que j'ai traversé. Je me sens chanceuse et bénie d'avoir pu m'échapper. Mais encore une fois, je pense que ça a fait de moi une meilleure personne. J'ai appris à être forte et je peux aider d'autres femmes dans cette situation.
The night Michigan forgot how to breathe did not arrive with thunder or sirens. It slipped in quietly, the way bad news often does, wrapped in routine and complacency, hiding inside an evening that looked like every other. Porch lights flicked on across a grid of modest streets. Televisions murmured in living rooms. Somewhere a phone rang, unanswered at first, then ringing again, insistent, impatient, as if it already knew that the world on the other end was about to tilt. This is where the cold case begins, not with violence in motion, but with a sudden absence that feels louder than noise. In 2002, this corner of Michigan trusted its patterns. People left doors unlocked. Cars stayed in driveways overnight. Neighbors measured safety by recognition, by the comfort of waving at familiar faces. The air that evening was sharp with early fall, leaves clinging stubbornly to branches, refusing to let go. Nothing in the weather warned of what was coming. Nothing in the sky signaled disaster. And yet, when the night was over, a life would be missing, and the silence left behind would stretch for decades. The first officers arrived to a scene that resisted definition. No broken glass. No overturned furniture. No obvious signs of struggle. Just a house that felt paused, as if someone had stepped out for a moment and forgotten to return. Shoes lined up near the door. Keys resting where they always rested. À pur Saint-Touched. The car still parked, engine cold. This was not chaos. This was order interrupted, and that made it worse. Investigators know this feeling. It crawl under the skin. It whispers that whatever happened did not want to be seen. Neighbors gathered in cautious clusters, speaking in low voices that carried anyway. Everyone had a version of the last sighting. A shadow crossing a yard. A sound that might have been a door. A car that didn't belong, or maybe did. Memory is unreliable in the presence of fear, and fear had arrived quickly. By midnight, the word missing was already losing its innocence. By morning, the word cold case was beginning to form, still distant, still unspoken, but inevitable. The victim's name moved fast. It traveled from police radios to newsrooms, from kitchen tables to factory floors. Flyers appeared almost overnight, stapled to telephone poles, taped to shop windows, pinned to bulletin boards. A face stared back at the town, smiling in a way that now felt accusatory, as if asking why no one had seen what was coming. Families walked together.
Parents helped children a little closer.
The community did what communities always do in moments like this. It searched itself for answers. Investigators worked without drama, without the luxury of time. They documented every detail, no matter how small. They photographed rooms that looked too normal. They logged objects that felt irrelevant but couldn't be ignored. They knocked on doors and asked the same questions over and over, hoping repetition would shake loose something honest, something forgotten. The answers came back fragmented. Everyone wanted to help. No one had what was needed. The early theories arrived quickly and hardened just as fast. Someone close. Someone trusted. Someone who knew the routines. It always starts there. Statistically, it makes sense. Emotionally, it devastates. Friends were questioned. Family members were scrutinized. Alibis were dissected. Relationships were mapped like crime scenes themselves, lines drawn and redrawn as investigators tried to understand where trust might have fractured into opportunity. Nothing held. Suspicion slid off without sticking. Attention shifted outward.
A stranger passing through. A chance en compter. A wrong place, wrong time scénario that spiraled out of control.
Tips poured in, then slowed. Each new lead promised clarity, then dissolved under scrutiny. Surveillance footage showed nothing at the right moment. Witnesses contradicted each other without meaning to. Timelines refused to align. The case stretched, elastic, resistant, as if it understood the value of patience better than anyone working it. Weeks turned into months. The search expanded and contracted like a lung struggling for air. Volunteers combed fields and wooded edges. Dogs traced scents that faded into nothing. Media interest peaked and waned. Headlines grew smaller. Segments shortened. Another story always arrived to take its place. But the town did not forget.
It learned to live with the gap, the anticipés where certainty used to be.
Detectives rotated in and out, carrying the case like a weight passed hand to hand. Fresh eyes tried old angles. Old evidence was re-examined, then returned to storage. The file grew thick, heavy with paper and frustration. Each page represented effort, time, hope. Each unanswered question pressed harder than the last. This is how cases go cold, not all at once, but gradually, as momentum drains away and only obligation remains. Years passed.
Technologie evolved.
DNA databases expanded.
Analytical tools improved.
The case waited. Evidence collected in 2002 sat dormant, preserved carefully, unaware that the future would someday know how to speak its language. The town aged. Children who had once seen the victim's face on posters grew up. Some left. Some stayed. The story became part of local folklore, told with caution, always ending the same way. No one knows what really happened. Anniversaries arrived quietly. Families marked them in private. Investigators reviewed the file periodically, driven by duty more than expectation. The word cold finally settled in, official and unforgiving. Cold case. A label that feels like a verdict even when it isn't. It suggests stasis, abandonment, an ending without closure. And yet, beneath the dust, the case was still alive, still waiting for the smallest spark. That spark did not come from a lab. It did not come from a witness. It came from a voice on a phone line years later, unexpected and steady, carrying words that no one was prepared to hear. A confession. Not coaxed. Not bargained. Spoken plainly, as if the speaker had rehearsed it in silence for years and finally decided the silence was worse. The sentence landed hard, collapsing decades of uncertainty into a single moment. Investigators did not celebrate. They listened. Confessions are treacherous. They can be gifts or traps, truth or theater. Every word had to be tested, every claim verified. The man spoke of details that had never been released. He corrected assumptions investigators hadn't realized were wrong. He placed himself inside the timeline with an accuracy that raised the temperature in the room.
Cold case, suddenly warming.
The file came off the shelf again. Evidence bags were reopened. Items once thought inert were examined with methods that did not exist in 2002. Fibers told new stories. Trace evidence found context. Patterns emerged where randomness had once ruled. The confession did not solve the case by itself. It unlocked it. It gave direction to a search that had been wandering in circles for 20 years. As news leaked, the town felt the old tension return. Phones buzzed. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Disbelief mixed with hope. A surprise confession had stunned investigators, and now it stunned the community. Could this really be it? Could decades of silence finally be ending? No one wanted to say yes too loudly. Everyone remembered disappointment too well. For the family, the call came with a weight no one could prepare them for. Answers were coming, but answers carry their own pain. Knowing is not the same as healing.
Knowing fixe the past in place.
It removes the possibility of a different ending. The room where they were told held its breath with them, aware that this moment would divide their lives into before and after, just as the night in 2002 had done. Outside, Michigan moved on with its day, unaware that a long-frozen story had begun to thaw. This was only the beginning of the reckoning, the first crack in decades of ice. The confession had spoken, but the truth still demanded proof. And as investigators followed the new path laid before them, one thing became clear: the silence that had defined this case for so long was finally breaking, and what emerged from it would change everything. The confession did not arrive with remorse dripping from every word. It arrived measured, controlled, almost careful, as if the speaker understood that truth, when delivered too dramatically, can sound like a lie. Investigators sat across the table, pens still, recording equipment humming softly, aware that every syllable mattered. This was not the end of a cold case. This was the moment it began to breathe again, drawing oxygen into lungs that had been collapsed for decades. He spoke of that night in 2002 without the cinematic flourish people expect. No raised voice. No shaking hands. Just a sequence of decisions, each one small enough to justify in isolation, catastrophic when stacked together. He described the neighborhood with the familiarity of someone who had walked it many times, not as a stranger passing through but as a presence woven quietly into the background of the victim's life. That detail alone shifted the room. Investigators exchanged glances they tried to hide. This was not random. This was intimate. As the confession unfolded, the case file began to reorganize itself in real time. Details once dismissed as coincidences now felt deliberate. A parked car that seemed out of place. A timeline gap no one could close. A witness statement that never quite fit but couldn't be disproven. The man filled those gaps calmly, methodically, explaining not just what happened, but why earlier theories had failed. He had relied on the town's assumptions, on investigators' understandable focus on certain suspects. He had waited while attention drifted elsewhere. But words alone were never going to be enough. Investigators pushed back, interrupting, demanding specifics. Locations. Times. Objects. He answered without hesitation. He described rooms he should not have known. He referenced items the public had never heard about. When challenged, he corrected them. Gently. That was when the temperature changed. Confessions can crumble under pressure. This one hardened. Outside the interview room, a different kind of work began. Evidence long archived was retrieved and catalogued again. Boxes were opened under sterile lights. Items were photographed anew, not because the originals were insufficient, but because perspective had changed. Technology had changed. The past was being interrogated with tools it had never faced before. Forensic analysts approached the material with cautious optimism.
Cold case teach restreint.
Too many times, hope has surged only to collapse under scrutiny. But this time, the confession provided a roadmap. Analysts knew what to look for, where to look, how to interpret what they found. Trace evidence that once seemed inconclusive now had context. Patterns began to align. The community, meanwhile, felt the shift before it was officially announced. Police activity increased. Unmarked cars appeared in familiar driveways. Rumors moved faster than facts, as they always do. Some people felt vindicated, convinced they had always known the truth. Others felt betrayed, realizing that someone they had trusted had been hiding in plain sight. The phrase cold case returned to conversations, no longer as a symbol of failure, but as a question finally being answered. Media coverage reignited with a different tone. This was not speculation. This was momentum. Headlines hinted at a breakthrough without saying too much. Reporters stood outside buildings they had long ago stopped visiting, delivering updates with careful language. Everyone understood the risk of saying the wrong thing too soon. The story had waited 20 years. It could wait a little longer to be told correctly. Inside the lab, results began to arrive. Fibers matched. Residue told a story of contact, not chance. The physical evidence did not just support the confession, it echoed it. Each confirmation tightened the net, reducing the space where doubt could hide. Investigators who had carried the case early in their careers, now older, some retired, were contacted and briefed. They listened quietly, absorbing the news with expressions that mixed relief and regret. Relief that the truth was emerging. Regret that it had taken so long. The suspect was brought in again, this time not just to speak, but to confront the weight of corroboration. Investigators laid out the findings piece by piece, not theatrically, but deliberately. They watched his reactions, noting where confidence flickered, where certainty wavered. He did not recant. He adjusted. He acknowledged details he had previously omitted, not to minimize his role, but to clarify it. The confession evolved, not by contradiction, but by expansion. This was when motive came into sharper focus. Not a grand scheme. Not a carefully plotted crime.
Something smaller, oublié.
A convergence of resentment, opportunity, and a belief that consequences could be avoided. The kind of motive that never makes sense to outsiders, because it makes perfect sense only to the person who acted on it. Investigators have seen it before. That familiarity did not make it easier to hear. As the narrative solidified, the victim emerged from abstraction. No longer just a name on a file or a face on a flyer, but a person with routines, relationships, and a future that had been quietly erased. Investigators revisited her life not as a mystery to be solved, but as a story interrupted. Friends were re-interviewed, this time with answers in mind. Their memories shifted too, reorganizing themselves around a truth that had been missing. The town responded in waves. Shock first, then anger, then a strange, heavy calm. Vigils were held again, this time not in hope, but in acknowledgement. Candles flickered under the same night sky that had watched everything happen and said nothing. People spoke the victim's name out loud, reclaiming it from years of uncertainty. Others avoided the gatherings entirely, unsure how to process the realization that the past had been living among them all along. Legal proceedings moved deliberately. Charges were prepared with care, built on layers of evidence rather than the confession alone. Prosecutors understood the scrutiny that would follow. Cold cases invite skepticism. Defense teams search for every inconsistency, every delay, every procedural misstep. The case had to be airtight, not just convincing. Justice delayed is already compromised. Justice denied would be unforgivable. Behind closed doors, investigators reflected on the long arc of the case. They spoke of missed opportunities, of moments that might have changed everything if seen differently. But they also acknowledged reality. In 2002, the tools had been limited. The assumptions had been reasonable. The silence had been effective. Cold cases are not just failures of effort, they are artifacts of their time. As the confession made its way into official record, its impact rippled outward. Other cold cases were reviewed. Tips came in from people emboldened by the news, believing that if one truth could surface after 20 years, others might too. The case became a reference point, a reminder that patience and persistence can coexist, that silence is not the same as absence.
For the family, the days blurred together.
Meetings with prosecutors. Conversations with victim advocates. Decisions about public statements. Grief resurfaced in unexpected forms, sharper now that uncertainty was gone. The not knowing had been its own kind of pain, but knowing brought finality, and finality is heavy. They spoke of relief cautiously, aware that it sounded too much like acceptance. As the suspect awaited the next stage of the process, the town held its breath again, this time not because of mystery, but because of consequence. The cold case label had done its work. It had preserved the story long enough for truth to catch up. Now, as evidence aligned and silence fractured, the case stood on the edge of resolution, carrying with it the weight of 20 years and the quiet promise that some endings, no matter how delayed, still matter. And somewhere between confession and confirmation, between past and present, the community understood something it hadn't before. The night Michigan forgot how to breathe had never really ended. It had simply been waiting for the moment when the truth would finally let it exhale. By the time the case reached the courtroom calendar, the word confession had already lost its simplicity. It no longer meant a man speaking in a room. It meant echoes. It meant consequences spreading outward, colliding with memories, reshaping timelines that had been frozen in amber since 2002. The cold case was no longer cold. It was volatile. And everyone could feel it. The first pretrial hearing drew a crowd that surprised even seasoned court officers. Not because people wanted spectacle, but because they wanted proximity. To truth. To accountability. To the quiet gravity of a moment they had waited 2 decades to witness. Faces filled the benches, some familiar, some older, all carrying a version of the same question. How did this live among us for so long without being seen? The prosecution laid out its intent with precision, not drama.
No sweeping statements.
No grand promises. Just a steady march through evidence that had been re-examined, retested, and recontextualized. DNA recovered from materials once deemed too degraded now spoke clearly under modern analysis. The genealogy trail did not replace the confession, it reinforced it, anchoring words to biology, memory to molecules. This was not a single pillar holding up a fragile case. This was a structure built redundantly, deliberately, to withstand time and doubt. The defense listened closely, taking notes, nodding occasionally, not because they agreed, but because they understood the terrain. Cold cases offer room to maneuver. Memories fade. Evidence ages. Procedures change. Their strategy was predictable, but no less dangerous for it. They would question contamination. They would question consent. They would question the reliability of a confession delivered decades after the fact. They would question everything, because that is their job. And because the stakes demanded it. Outside, the media assembled narratives faster than facts could travel. Headlines sharpened. Language hardened. The phrase surprise confession became shorthand, repeated until it lost nuance. Some outlets framed it as redemption for law enforcement. Others framed it as a cautionary tale about justice delayed. Both missed something essential. This was not about victory. It was about repair, and repair is never clean. Investigators returned to the scene once more, not because they needed to, but because they could. With fresh eyes, guided by a full account, they walked through spaces that had haunted them for years. They noticed things they had missed not because they were incompetent, but because they had been human. The way sound traveled in the hallway. The angle of a light fixture. The narrowness of a doorframe that explained a mark no one could previously account for. The environment itself seemed to cooperate now, as if relieved to finally be understood. Witnesses were recontacted. Some declined to speak, exhausted by years of uncertainty. Others welcomed the chance, their voices steadier now that answers existed. One neighbor recalled a sound that had never quite made sense. Another remembered a brief interaction dismissed at the time as insignificant. Alone, these details had been noise. Together, they formed a signal that pointed in only one direction. The accused remained composed through it all. In custody, he maintained the same measured demeanor that had defined his confession. No public outbursts.
No dramatique denial.
Just a quiet acknowledgement of the process unfolding around him. Psychologists consulted by the court noted the absence of visible remorse but cautioned against drawing conclusions. Emotional expression is not evidence. Behavior is. And the behavior told a story of someone who had long ago made peace with what he had done, believing the world had moved on with him hidden inside it. The victim's family prepared for testimony with the help of advocates trained to navigate this exact terrain. They rehearsed not for performance, but for survival. Every detail would reopen wounds. Every question would demand clarity where memory had been protected by distance. They understood that the defense would not attack them personally, but the effect could be the same. In a courtroom, grief becomes something to be examined, weighed, sometimes doubted. That reality sat heavy on their shoulders. As motions were filed and argued, the judge emphasized patience. Cold cases require careful handling, not because they are fragile, but because they are dense. Years of history must be unpacked without distortion. The court schedule stretched. Weeks turned into months. The community waited, restless but attentive, aware that rushing now would only risk everything that had been gained. During this time, the story of the case seeped into broader conversations about justice, about the limits of technology, about the persistence of truth. Law enforcement agencies across the state reviewed their own unsolved files, inspired not by the confession itself, but by the methodical work that followed it. This case was not solved by luck. It was solved by refusal to let silence be the final word. Behind the scenes, analysts continued their work, responding to defense challenges with data, not opinion. Chain of custody records were reconstructed. Storage conditions were documented. Every possible vulnerability was identified and reinforced. The goal was not to overwhelm the court, but to leave no space for reasonable doubt to masquerade as technicality. When the trial date was finally set, the announcement landed with a thud rather than a cheer. There was no celebration, just a collective tightening of focus. This was the moment when narrative would meet scrutiny, when the voiceover of history would be cross-examined under oath. Jury selection unfolded with quiet intensity. Potential jurors were asked about their exposure to the case, their opinions on cold cases, their trust in forensic science. Some were dismissed for knowing too much, others for knowing too little. In the end, 12 individuals were chosen not for their neutrality alone, but for their willingness to listen. Opening statements began without spectacle. The prosecution spoke of a life interrupted, of evidence preserved against odds, of a confession that aligned with facts no one could fabricate. The defense countered with caution, reminding the jury that time erodes certainty, that memory is malleable, that science, while powerful, is not infallible. Both sides were telling the truth, just not the same truth. As witnesses took the stand, the past unfolded in fragments. A forensic expert explained how DNA once considered unusable had been amplified and matched through genealogical databases. A detective described the moment the confession shifted from curiosity to credibility. A neighbor spoke haltingly about a sound she had dismissed, now heavy with implication. Each testimony added weight, not just to the case, but to the room itself. When the victim's family spoke, the courtroom stilled. Their words were not accusations. They were recollections. Of birthdays missed. Of routines broken. Of the long ache of not knowing. The defense did not cross-examine aggressively. There was nothing to gain. Some truths do not weaken under questioning. They deepen. The accused listened, expression unchanged. When it was his turn to speak, he did not repeat his confession verbatim. He contextualized it. He acknowledged choices. He avoided excuses. The prosecution pressed him on specifics. He answered. The defense asked about the passage of time, about memory decay. He conceded uncertainty where it existed. That honesty, unsettling as it was, only strengthened the perception that this was not a performance. As closing arguments approached, the weight of the case settled fully onto the jury. They were not just deciding guilt. They were deciding whether decades of silence could be broken without breaking the principles meant to protect everyone. Whether truth delayed could still be truth delivered. The judge's instructions were clear. Evidence over emotion. Reason over speculation. The room emptied as deliberations began, leaving behind the echo of a story that had waited too long to be heard. And in that waiting, in that charged silence, Michigan held its breath again. Not in fear. Not in doubt. But in recognition that the past, once confronted, does not disappear. It asks to be carried forward, acknowledged, and finally, answered. Deliberations began without ceremony, the jury room door closing softly, as if aware that any sound too loud might fracture the balance inside. 12 people sat with binders thickened by years, by science, by grief translated into exhibits. The clock on the wall ticked, indifferent. Outside, the courthouse settled into a familiar hush, but inside that room, time folded in on itself, pulling 2002 into the present and asking it to answer. They started where juries often do, with what felt most solid. The DNA. Charts were laid out. Notes were compared. One juror traced the genealogy tree with a finger, careful, methodical, following branches back through generations until the path narrowed to a single name. Another juror raised a concern about contamination, repeating the defense's warnings, not as skepticism but as diligence. The room did not argue. It examined. They reviewed chain of custody logs, storage conditions, lab protocols. They talked through how technology had changed, how standards had evolved, how evidence had been preserved not perfectly, but faithfully. Then the confession. Words spoken in a room years after the crime, calm, unadorned, unsettling in their clarity. Some jurors struggled with it.
Confession Ardange-Roussings.
History teaches caution. False admissions exist.
Pressure d'Histoire-Trousse.
But this confession had not stood alone. It had been tested against details the public never knew. It had anticipated evidence before it was presented. It had corrected investigators when memory or assumption drifted. The jurors listened to the recording again, this time not as observers, but as arbiters, weighing tone not for emotion, but for alignment with fact. They moved next to the witnesses.
The neighbor who heard a sound.
The friend who noticed a change. The expert who explained why a single fiber mattered more than 100 guesses. Each testimony carried its own gravity. The jurors acknowledged the limitations of memory, but also its persistence.
Some things fade.
Others calcify. Trauma does not erase, it preserves selectively, locking moments in place with brutal precision. Hours passed. Lunch arrived untouched.
Discussion deepened.
They debated reasonable doubt not as a slogan, but as a responsibility. What did doubt look like here? Was it the passage of time? The delay in justice? Or was doubt the absence of corroboration, the presence of alternative explanations? They searched for alternatives. They found none that held. By evening, consensus began to form, not through pressure, but through convergence. Each line of inquiry returned to the same point. Each question answered itself the same way. The case did not rely on a single revelation. It relied on accumulation. Layer upon layer of consistency. The kind that does not shout, but endures. When the foreperson finally knocked, the sound echoed louder than it should have. The courtroom reconvened with practiced efficiency, but the tension was unmistakable. The accused stood, hands folded, expression unchanged. The victim's family sat together, shoulders nearly touching, as if proximity could provide insulation against what came next. The verdict was read once, clearly. Guilty.
No gasps. No cheers.
Just a collective exhale that felt like release and collapse at the same time. Justice, when it arrives this late, does not feel triumphant. It feels heavy. It feels like something finally set down after being carried too far, too long. Sentencing was scheduled weeks later, allowing space for impact statements, for reports, for the machinery of consequence to assemble properly. In the interim, the community processed what it meant to live in the aftermath of an ending. Conversations shifted. The case stopped being a question and became a fact. That transition was harder than many expected. Some felt relief immediately. Others felt hollow. The cold case had been a shared burden, a mystery that bound the town in quiet solidarity. With it solved, something communal dissolved. The story no longer belonged to everyone. It belonged to the record, to the court, to the family who had paid the highest price. At sentencing, the courtroom filled again, this time with a different energy. Less suspense. More gravity. The prosecution spoke briefly, summarizing a journey that had taken decades and ended exactly where it should have begun, with accountability. The defense argued mitigation, pointing to age, to the absence of prior convictions, to a life lived mostly unseen by the justice system. The judge listened, unmoved but attentive, aware that punishment must speak not only to the past, but to the future. When the victim's family addressed the court, their words were measured, not vengeful. They spoke of loss without embellishment, of waiting, of birthdays that passed without candles, of a silence that settled into daily life and never quite lifted. They did not ask for forgiveness. They did not demand cruelty. They asked for acknowledgement. For the court to say, unequivocally, that what was taken mattered. The accused declined to make a statement. The judge noted it without commentary. Silence, in this case, had already said enough. The sentence reflected the totality of the case. Years measured not just by statute, but by impact. As it was read, the room absorbed it quietly. No one expected closure to feel clean. Closure is a myth. What exists instead is containment. The harm is named. The responsibility assigned. The rest becomes something each person must carry differently. In the days that followed, the media moved on with practiced efficiency. New stories replaced old ones. Headlines softened. The case slipped from the front page into archives, where it would live again as reference, as precedent, as proof. Investigators returned to their desks, to other files, other names, other silences waiting to be broken. But the effects lingered. In police departments, training sessions referenced the case as an example of patience rewarded. In forensic labs, protocols were reviewed with renewed respect for preservation. In living rooms, people revisited their assumptions about safety, about familiarity, about the comfort of believing that monsters look different than neighbors. For the family, life resumed in fragments. Some routines returned. Others did not. Grief, once suspended by uncertainty, now flowed differently. It was sharper in some ways, clearer in others. They visited the grave with a new sense of finality, speaking aloud things they had held back, now that the truth no longer hovered unresolved above them. The town marked the anniversary quietly. No official ceremony. No speeches. Just a candle lit in a window. A moment of silence at a community meeting. A shared understanding that something had shifted permanently. The cold case had ended, but its imprint remained, etched into collective memory. Years from now, someone would stumble across the file, perhaps a student, perhaps a journalist, perhaps a detective looking for guidance. They would read about the evidence, the confession, the trial. They would see dates and names and outcomes. What they would not see easily was the waiting. The long, grinding patience. The nights when nothing happened. The years when hope dimmed and flared and dimmed again. That part of the story lives outside the record, carried by those who endured it. It lives in the way a community learned to sit with uncertainty. In the way investigators learned humility.
In the way a family learned endurance.
Michigan's 2002 cold case did not end with a bang. It ended with a sentence read aloud, a door closing, and a truth finally placed where it belonged. Not erased. Not redeemed. Just acknowledged. And in that acknowledgement, the silence that had stretched across decades did not vanish. It changed shape. It became something quieter, something bearable. A reminder that even after years of darkness, the past can still be faced, named, and answered, if not with peace, then with something close enough to let the living move forward. In the weeks after sentencing, the case did not disappear so much as it settled, like dust after demolition, coating everything lightly, invisibly, reminding those nearby that something heavy had come down. The courthouse returned to routine, files stacked and moved, calendars filled with new names, but the echoes lingered in hallways where people still spoke a little softer, as if the walls themselves remembered what had been said there. The cold case was officially closed, yet closure proved to be an administrative word, not an emotional one. For investigators, the end brought an unfamiliar stillness. Many had lived with the case for years, some since their earliest days on the force. It had followed them through promotions, transfers, retirements. It had been the file they revisited late at night, the one they thought about while driving familiar streets, wondering what they had missed. Now, with the verdict entered and the sentence imposed, that constant presence was gone. Relief came first, sharp and unexpected. Then something like grief. When a mystery ends, it takes part of you with it. They gathered informally one evening, not as officers but as people who had shared a burden. There was no toast, no speech. Just quiet acknowledgement. They spoke about how young they had been when it started, how different policing was in 2002, how much faith they had placed in instincts that later proved incomplete. There was no bitterness, only perspective. The case had taught them patience the hard way, and patience, once learned, does not fade. Across town, the victim's family navigated a different aftermath. The rituals of justice were over. Court dates no longer structured their weeks. Calls from prosecutors slowed, then stopped. For years, the case had provided a strange kind of purpose, a reason to wake up and keep asking questions. Now, with answers delivered, the days stretched open again, unmarked. They learned quickly that resolution does not fill the space left by loss. It simply defines its edges. They sorted through old belongings, not as evidence, but but as memory. Letters. Photographs. Objects once handled with care because they might matter to the case were now just what they had always been, remnants of a life interrupted. Some items were boxed away. Others were displayed more prominently, reclaimed from the shadow of investigation. The victim's name, once spoken cautiously, was said freely now, no longer tethered to a question mark. The community adjusted in quieter ways. People revisited moments they had dismissed years earlier. A wave from a neighbor. A brief conversation at a store. Harmless interactions that now carried a different weight. It wasn't paranoia. It was recalibration. The realization that evil does not always announce itself, that it can exist comfortably inside routine, forced a collective reevaluation of what safety feels like. Local schools incorporated the case into discussions about forensic science and ethics, careful to emphasize respect over spectacle. Teachers spoke about how technology evolves, how evidence can outlast assumptions, how patience and rigor matter more than speed. The case became an example not of horror, but of persistence. Students listened differently when they understood that the story had unfolded in the same streets they walked every day. Law enforcement agencies beyond Michigan took notice as well. Conferences referenced the investigation as a model for reopening cold cases responsibly. Not because it had ended in conviction, but because of how it had been handled after the confession. The emphasis on corroboration. The refusal to rely on a single narrative. The humility to admit earlier limitations without defensiveness. These lessons mattered more than the outcome. The accused settled into incarceration with little fanfare. Appeals were discussed, then filed, as expected. The legal process continued its slow, methodical churn. But the public attention faded. Without mystery, there was no appetite for speculation. He became another name in a system built to hold names quietly. For some, that felt insufficient. For others, it was exactly right. Justice, they realized, does not require constant witnessing to exist. Anniversaries came and went. The first one after the verdict felt heavy, charged with meaning. The second felt quieter. By the third, the date passed with little public notice, though those closest to the case felt it all the same. Time did what it always does, smoothing sharp edges without erasing the shape underneath. Occasionally, a reporter reached out, asking for comment on a retrospective piece. Investigators declined more often than not. They had said what needed to be said in court. The rest belonged to history now. The family sometimes agreed, but only to redirect the focus. They spoke not about the crime, but about the person lost, about who she was before she became a headline, before her life was reduced to a file number and a cause of death. In moments of reflection, some investigators admitted to themselves that they had feared this ending as much as they had hoped for it. A solved cold case closes doors. It answers questions that, for better or worse, had become familiar companions. But it also affirms something essential: that time does not erase responsibility. That silence is not absolution. That the truth, once set in motion, tends to find its way to the surface, even if it takes decades. The case influenced policy in subtle ways. Evidence storage protocols were updated. Digital archiving expanded. Grants were secured for genealogical analysis in other long unsolved cases. None of these changes were announced with grand statements. They simply happened, folded into the system quietly, like reinforcements added after a structural failure. The goal was not to celebrate progress, but to prevent repetition. For the family, healing remained uneven. Some days felt lighter. Others reopened wounds without warning.
À 111 Radio. À Familiar 100.
A stranger with a similar laugh. Grief does not follow linear timelines, and justice does not reorder it neatly. But there was comfort in knowing that the story no longer hovered unresolved. That the world, officially and unequivocally, recognized what had been taken from them. They established a small scholarship in the victim's name, focused on students interested in science and investigation. It was not about revenge or remembrance alone. It was about continuity. About turning an ending into a beginning, however modest. Each year, when a recipient was announced, the family felt a quiet satisfaction that something constructive had grown from devastation. Years later, a new detective flipped through the closed case file during training, drawn to it by reputation. He read about the early missteps, the long silence, the confession that changed everything. He noted the margin comments, the revisions, the the careful language of the final reports. When he closed the file, he did not feel awe. He felt responsibility. The understanding that every unsolved case is not just a puzzle, but a promise deferred. The Michigan 2002 cold case had ended, but its influence continued to ripple outward, shaping how people thought about time, truth, and accountability. It reminded those who encountered it that justice is not a moment, but a process, often invisible, often frustrating, sometimes painfully slow. And somewhere between the last gavel strike and the quiet routines that followed, a hard-earned lesson took root, that even when years pass without answers, the story is not over. It is waiting. Waiting for the right question. The right tool. The right moment when silence finally gives way, not to noise, but to truth spoken clearly, carried forward, and finally allowed to rest. Time did not stop once the case was closed. It never does. Instead, it moved forward with a subtle shift in weight, as if something long carried had finally been set down, leaving behind the faint ache of absence. In Michigan, the streets looked the same, the seasons turned as they always had, but beneath the routines, the solved cold case continued to exert a quiet gravity. It had changed the way people listened. It had changed the way silence sounded. For law enforcement, the case became a reference point not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. Training rooms echoed with its lessons. New recruits heard it discussed not as a triumph, but as a reminder of endurance. Instructors spoke about the years when nothing moved, when leads dried up, when the file sat untouched except for the occasional dusting of hope. They emphasized how easy it is to confuse inactivity with failure, and how dangerous that assumption can be. Cold cases, they said, are not dead. They are dormant. Detectives who had worked the case early on found themselves contacted by younger colleagues, asking questions that had less to do with technique and more to do with psychology. How do you live with an unanswered question for 20 years? How do you keep perspective when every day brings new demands, new crimes, new urgencies? The answers were never neat. Some spoke of compartmentalization. Others admitted they never truly learned how to let go. The case had been a constant whisper in the back of their minds, reminding them that not every story resolves on schedule. In forensic laboratories, the impact was equally enduring. Technicians reviewed the evidence chain from the case, noting where preservation had succeeded against odds and where luck had filled gaps science could not. It reinforced a simple but critical truth: evidence is not just physical material. It is potential. Stored properly, it carries the future inside it. Mishandled, it becomes silence. The Michigan case became a quiet argument for patience in an era obsessed with speed. Outside institutional walls, the community processed the case in its own uneven rhythm. Some people stopped talking about it altogether, as if naming it might reopen something fragile. Others brought it up unexpectedly, in grocery store lines, at school events, during long drives. The conversations were no longer speculative. They were reflective. People asked different questions now. Not who did it, but how did we live alongside this without knowing? And what does that say about how we see each other? Trust, once cracked, does not shatter loudly. It splinters slowly. Neighbors became more observant, not suspicious, but attentive. Familiarity was no longer mistaken for safety. Parents spoke differently to their children, not in fear, but in realism. The world, they explained, is not divided neatly into good and bad. It is complicated. And understanding that complexity is part of growing up. The victim's family found that public interest, though diminished, never vanished entirely. Letters still arrived occasionally, some from strangers expressing sympathy, others from people who shared their own stories of unresolved loss.
The family read everyone.
They responded when they could. There was comfort in knowing that their experience had resonated beyond their immediate circle, that it had given language to grief others carried quietly. Privately, they continued to navigate the strange duality of closure. There was relief in certainty, but also a renewed sense of finality that settled in heavy waves. Dreams shifted. Where once they had dreamed of answers, now they dreamed of moments before the crime, of ordinary days reimagined with unbearable clarity. The mind, freed from speculation, returned to memory. That return was both gift and burden. On the anniversary of the arrest, the family visited the place where the victim had last been seen alive. There were no cameras.
No announcements.
Just them, standing quietly, acknowledging the space without trying to assign it meaning. Sometimes they understood, places do not need to be transformed. They simply need to be witnessed, honestly, without the weight of unanswered questions pressing down. The legal system continued its slow, almost imperceptible echo. Appeals moved forward, procedural and expected. Judges reviewed transcripts dense with testimony and data. Arguments were raised about timing, about reliability, about fairness. None of it surprised anyone. The case had been built to withstand this phase. Each appeal felt less like a threat and more like a formality, the system checking itself as designed. Meanwhile, other cold cases benefited indirectly. Families who had long been told there was nothing more to be done were contacted again, cautiously, with no promises. Evidence was re-examined. Files reopened. Not every case moved forward. Many did not. But the mere act of looking again changed something fundamental. It told families that time had not erased their worth. Within police departments, a shift in culture was noticeable. Younger detectives were encouraged to document not just facts, but uncertainties. To note what they did not know as carefully as what they believed. The Michigan case had shown how assumptions harden into obstacles over time. Recording doubt, it turned out, was as important as recording confidence. As years passed, the story of the case slowly migrated from current memory into institutional memory. It became something people referenced rather than relived. That transition was inevitable. But it did not diminish its significance. If anything, it strengthened it. Stories that endure without constant retelling tend to do so because they contain something essential. The accused, aging in custody, became less a figure of fascination and more a symbol. Not of evil, but of consequence. His name faded from conversation, replaced by broader discussions about accountability and time. The absence of spectacle around his incarceration was, in its own way, appropriate. The case had never been about him. It had been about what his actions took, and what it cost everyone else to wait for the truth. Occasionally, a documentary producer or podcast host reached out, hoping to revisit the story with dramatic flair. Most requests were declined. Those that were accepted came with conditions: no reenactments, no sensational music, no reduction of a human life to a plot device. The family, supported by advocates, had learned the power of boundaries. Their story was not content. It was lived experience. In quieter moments, some investigators admitted that the case had changed how they thought about endings. They no longer believed in clean resolutions. They believed in accountability, in acknowledgement, in the idea that justice is not a switch flipped, but a direction chosen. The Michigan cold case had not fixed the past. It had confronted it. That distinction mattered. Years later, a young woman researching forensic genealogy for a graduate thesis stumbled across the case. She read about the DNA match, the confession, the decades of silence. She wrote in the margins of her notes not about technique, but about patience, about restraint, about the ethics of using powerful tools carefully. When she later entered the field, she carried that perspective with her, one more ripple from a story that refused to stay contained. The town itself changed subtly. New families moved in, unaware of the history beneath their feet. Others stayed, carrying memory forward quietly. The case became part of the town's identity, not as a stain, but as a testament. A reminder that even when answers take decades, they can still arrive. And when they do, they reshape everything that comes after. On a cold evening years later, a candle flickered in a window once again, not for an anniversary, not for a headline, but for remembrance. No one else noticed. No one needed to. The gesture was private, intentional, sufficient. The Michigan 2002 cold case had taught those who lived through it that silence is not emptiness. It is a space where truth can hide, but also where it can wait. And when it finally emerges, it does not roar. It speaks quietly, firmly, asking not for celebration, but for recognition. In that recognition, life continues. Changed. Marked. A little more cautious. A little more aware. Carrying forward the understanding that some stories take a lifetime to tell, and that listening, truly listening, is often the hardest and most necessary part of justice. Long after the headlines faded and the court transcripts were filed away, the case continued to live in subtler places. It surfaced in pauses during conversations, in moments when someone hesitated before dismissing a detail as insignificant. The Michigan cold case had rewired instincts. It had taught people that what seems small can endure, that what is ignored can wait patiently, that time does not erase truth, it only tests it. For the detectives who remained active, the case altered how they approached every new scene. They slowed down. Not in urgency, but in attention. They took photographs they might once have skipped. They preserved items others might have dismissed. They asked questions that felt redundant because they had learned how absence of certainty can masquerade as clarity. The solved case became a quiet mentor, reminding them that the future might need what the present overlooks. One investigator, now nearing retirement, found himself thinking less about the day of the arrest and more about the early days, when the case was young and hope was raw. He remembered knocking on doors, sensing that the truth was close but unreachable, like a sound heard through a wall. Back then, he had believed that resolution was a matter of proximity. Now he understood it was often a matter of endurance. The truth does not always reveal itself to the most determined. Sometimes it reveals itself to the most patient. In training sessions, younger officers asked about intuition, about gut feelings. The veteran answered carefully. Intuition matters, he said, but only when it is disciplined by evidence and humility. In 2002, instincts had pointed in many directions. Some were wrong. Some were incomplete. The case had taught him that intuition is a starting point, not a destination. The forensic community continued to dissect the case in professional journals, not as a triumph of technology alone, but as a study in restraint. Analysts wrote about the decision to wait for corroboration, about resisting the urge to declare victory at the first DNA match. They emphasized how genealogy had opened doors, but also how easily it could mislead if treated as definitive rather than directional. The Michigan case became a warning as much as a model. Powerful tools require careful hands. In the town itself, the rhythm of daily life absorbed the story fully. Children who had not been born when the crime occurred grew up hearing about it not as a mystery, but as history. Teachers mentioned it in passing, parents referenced it cautiously. It became one of those shared understandings that shape a place without dominating it. The crime no longer defined the community, but it had left an imprint that would not fully fade. Some residents found themselves revisiting old journals, old calendars, old photographs from the early 2000s. They looked at faces, places, moments frozen in time, wondering what they had missed. This was not guilt. It was curiosity sharpened by hindsight. The realization that life had unfolded normally around something so dark unsettled them. But it also grounded them. Normalcy, they learned, is not proof of safety. It is simply the absence of visible disruption. The victim's family reached a stage of grief that felt unfamiliar. For years, anger and uncertainty had provided momentum. Now, with the truth established and responsibility assigned, those emotions softened into something heavier and quieter. Sadness, unbuffered by questions, took center stage.
It demandait d'attention in a différent way.
There was no investigation to follow, no updates to await. Just memory, persistent and intimate. They sought counseling, not because they were broken, but because they understood that healing is work. In those sessions, they spoke about how the case had shaped their identities, how they had been known in the community not just as people, but as representatives of a tragedy. Letting go of that role felt strange, almost like abandonment. But over time, they learned to separate remembrance from definition. The loss would always be part of them. It did not have to be all of them. The scholarship they established grew quietly. Each year, a new recipient was chosen, a student interested in science, justice, or investigation. At the small ceremonies, the family spoke briefly, focusing not on the crime, but on curiosity, perseverance, and ethics. They wanted the legacy to be forward-facing, to honor not just what had been taken, but what could still be built. Occasionally, the case resurfaced in unexpected ways. A national news outlet would publish a list of cold cases solved through DNA, and Michigan 2002 would appear among them. Comments would fill with reactions from strangers, some expressing amazement, others cynicism. The family stopped reading them. The public narrative no longer belonged to them. Their relationship with the truth was private now, insulated from commentary. The accused, meanwhile, receded further into the background of public consciousness. His appeals moved through the system with predictable results. Each denial reaffirmed what the trial had already established. Over time, his name lost its power to provoke. He became a footnote in a larger story about accountability and time. That reduction felt appropriate. The case had never been about amplifying his voice. It had been about restoring one that had been silenced. In academic circles, criminology students debated the ethical implications of delayed justice. Some argued that time dilutes culpability, that decades of law-abiding behavior should matter. Others countered that harm does not expire, that accountability delayed is not accountability diminished. The Michigan case served as a reference point, grounding abstract arguments in lived reality. It reminded students that behind every theory is a family waiting, a community altered, a truth suspended. The town council eventually approved a modest memorial, not a monument, but a plaque placed in a quiet public space. It did not list details. It did not dramatize. It simply named the victim and acknowledged the years of waiting. The unveiling was small, attended by few. That intimacy mattered. The memorial was not for visitors. It was for those who had lived through the silence. As time moved on, new cases demanded attention, new mysteries emerged. But something had shifted permanently. There was less impatience with unsolved crimes, more understanding that answers sometimes arrive on timelines that defy expectation. The Michigan cold case had recalibrated hope. Not inflated it, but steadied it. One evening, a young detective sat alone in the office, reviewing an old unsolved file. He felt the familiar frustration rising, the sense that progress was impossible. Then he remembered the Michigan case.
Note the arrest. Note the verdict.
The waiting. The years of apparent stagnation. He closed the file, took a breath, and wrote a note in the margin, "Preserve everything." It was a small act. But small acts endure. In the broader cultural conversation, the case contributed to a growing recognition that justice systems must think long-term. That funding decisions made today shape answers decades from now. That evidence rooms are not storage spaces, but time capsules. That patience is not passive. It is active restraint. For those closest to the case, life continued in ordinary ways. Jobs changed. Children grew. Relationships evolved. The case did not vanish from their identities, but it no longer dominated them. It became a chapter rather than the whole book. That shift, subtle and hard one, marked real progress. Years later, on an unremarkable afternoon, the victim's sibling found an old voicemail saved on a forgotten device. The voice was familiar, warm, alive. Listening to it brought tears, but also a strange peace. The voice existed beyond the crime, beyond the case. It reminded them that a life is not defined by how it ends, but by how it is remembered. The Michigan 2002 cold case had traveled a long arc, from shock to silence, from silence to truth, from truth to consequence. But its final destination was not a courtroom or a headline. It was understanding. An understanding that justice is not loud. That it does not always arrive when summoned. That sometimes, it waits until those seeking it are ready to receive it without illusion. And in that understanding, something settled. Not closure, not forgiveness, but acceptance. The kind that allows memory to coexist with movement. That allows the past to inform the future without imprisoning it. The case had begun with a life taken and a community stunned. It ended years later with a lesson absorbed quietly, that even after decades of silence, the truth can still rise, steady and unyielding, asking only to be seen, acknowledged, and carried forward with care. In the end, that was the lasting impact. Not the shock of the confession. Not the drama of the verdict. But the enduring awareness that listening, preserving, and waiting are not signs of weakness. They are acts of faith in a justice that may arrive late, but arrives nonetheless, reshaping everything it touches long after the noise fades. By the time the confession began to echo through official channels, it was no longer just an investigative event. It became a psychological tremor, spreading outward through departments, families, and memories that had learned to stay quiet. The Michigan 2002 cold case did not end with a single sentence spoken in an interrogation room. It unraveled slowly, like a knot loosened thread by thread, revealing how deeply silence had embedded itself into every layer of the story. The first wave hit the investigators who had once worked the case and then moved on. Some were retired, some promoted, some no longer wearing a badge at all. When the news reached them, it arrived without warning, usually through a phone call that began casually and then paused, heavy with implication. "Do you remember that case from '02? The question alone was enough to bring it all back. The smell of paper files. The low hum of fluorescent lights. The sense that something vital had slipped just out of reach. For many of them, the confession forced a reckoning. They replayed interviews in their minds, scrutinized decisions made under pressure, wondered if a different question, a longer pause, a sharper instinct might have shortened the decades of waiting. But the dominant emotion was not regret. It was awe. Awe at how long the truth had waited. Awe at how quietly it had survived. Inside the evidence vault, items that had once been logged and forgotten took on new gravity. The box that had been handled by half a dozen technicians now felt almost sacred. Each seal, each label, each careful notation had mattered more than anyone could have known at the time. The case became a living argument for procedure, for discipline, for treating every detail as if the future depended on it, because sometimes it does. The confession itself was not cinematic. There was no dramatic outburst, no sudden collapse into tears. It was measured, controlled, almost rehearsed. That calm unsettled those who heard it. After decades of silence, the words came too easily, like something long memorized. It raised a chilling question that no one could fully answer. How long had this person been carrying the truth, intact and undisturbed, while the rest of the world searched? As transcripts circulated, analysts noticed patterns in the language. The pauses. The deflections. The moments where details sharpened unexpectedly. These were not the hesitations of someone reconstructing a memory. They were the slips of someone remembering too clearly. The confession did not just confirm guilt. It exposed familiarity, an intimacy with the crime that could not be fabricated. The legal process moved forward with deliberate caution. Prosecutors knew the weight of the moment. A cold case confession is both powerful and fragile. It demands corroboration, context, restraint. Every claim was cross-checked against evidence that had survived 20 years of dormancy. When the pieces aligned, the alignment felt almost unnatural, as if time itself had stepped aside to allow the truth through. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was subdued. There was no applause, no visible triumph. The family sat together, not holding hands, but close enough to feel each other's presence. Their expressions carried something beyond relief. They carried exhaustion. The kind that comes from holding a question open for most of a lifetime. When the confession was entered into the record, it landed not as a climax, but as a release. A pressure that had built slowly, invisibly, finally vented. Some in the room felt dizzy, others numb. Justice, when delayed this long, does not arrive cleanly. It brings with it everything it passed along the way. Outside the courthouse, reporters searched for words strong enough to capture the moment. Shocking. Unbelievable. Long overdue. The headlines tried to compress decades into a single line, but those closest to the case understood that no phrase could contain what had just happened. This was not an ending. It was a transformation. The community reacted in waves. First came disbelief. Then conversation. Then reflection. People who had lived near the crime scene revisited old routines in their minds. Night walks. Locked doors.
Childhood warning.
They realized how much of their behavior had been shaped by a threat that had never been named, only felt. Some residents felt anger rising unexpectedly. Anger at the perpetrator, yes, but also at the randomness of it all. That such violence could occur, lie dormant, and then re-emerge decades later forced them to confront the fragility of certainty. Safety, they realized, is often a story we tell ourselves, maintained by the absence of contradiction. For younger generations, the case landed differently. To them, it was history, a reminder that the past is not static. That technology can reach backward. That secrets are not erased by time, only postponed. Schools discuss the case in civics classes, not as true crime entertainment, but as a lesson in persistence and accountability. The family of the victim faced a new and unexpected challenge, redefining their grief. For years, the mystery had been a companion, painful but familiar. It had given shape to their loss, something to push against. Now, with the truth exposed, the grief stood alone. Undistracted. Undeniable. They spoke privately about moments they had delayed, waiting for answers. Holidays overshadowed by uncertainty. Decisions postponed because closure felt necessary first. Now they understood that life had moved forward regardless, and they had moved with it, carrying the unanswered question like a second heartbeat. Letting go of that rhythm felt strange, almost disorienting. Counselors described this phase as regrieving, mourning not just the loss itself, but the years shaped by not knowing. It required patience. It required compassion for themselves. It required accepting that resolution does not simplify grief, it complicates it. Meanwhile, within law enforcement circles, the case sparked renewed attention to other dormant files. Cold cases long dismissed as unsolvable were pulled from shelves, not out of optimism, but out of respect. The Michigan case had demonstrated that dormancy does not equal defeat. It had shown that waiting is not wasted if it is intentional. Departments began auditing their evidence storage practices. They updated protocols. They invested in training. Not because the confession had embarrassed them, but because it had educated them. It had revealed how decisions made in ordinary moments can echo for decades. The perpetrator's confession also ignited debate about motive. Why now? Why speak after so long? Psychologists offered theories. Guilt intensified by age.
Fear of dying with the secret.
A desire for control, even at the end. None of the explanations felt complete. The truth was likely fragmented, layered, inaccessible. Some motivations are never fully knowable. What mattered more than why was what? What had been done? What had been hidden? What had finally been acknowledged? The confession stripped away speculation and left reality exposed, stark and irreversible. As sentencing approached, the tone remained restrained. There was no appetite for spectacle. The case had outgrown drama. It demanded solemnity. When the sentence was delivered, it was firm, measured, unadorned. Justice spoke in plain language, finally catching up to a crime that had waited far too long. Afterward, life did not return to normal. It shifted. Subtly. Permanently. The case became a reference point, a shared memory that carried new meaning. It was no longer a symbol of uncertainty, but of endurance. Of the idea that truth can survive neglect, obscurity, even intentional concealment. In quiet moments, some investigators admitted that the case haunted them less now. Not because it was forgotten, but because it had been answered. The unanswered question is heavier than the answer, no matter how painful that answer may be. The Michigan 2002 cold case had crossed a threshold. It was no longer defined by silence. It had entered a new phase, one shaped by reflection rather than pursuit. The hunt was over. The reckoning had begun. And as the noise faded, as cameras turned elsewhere, one thing remained clear: the confession had not closed the past. It had illuminated it. And in that light, everyone touched by the case was forced to see not just what had happened, but how deeply time itself had been altered by a truth that refused to stay buried. The ninth movement of this story does not open with sirens or flashing lights. It opens with something far quieter, far more unsettling. It opens with time catching its breath. Because after the confession shook the system, after the headlines burned hot and then cooled, what remained was the long echo, the phase no one prepares for, when a cold case solved does not feel solved at all, when answers create new shadows instead of erasing the old ones. In Michigan, the calendar kept turning, indifferent to revelation. Snow fell again. Roads froze, thawed, cracked, were repaired. People went to work, came home, watched the news with half an eye. But beneath that surface rhythm, the case lingered like a low-frequency hum. Not loud enough to dominate conversation, not quiet enough to disappear. A solved cold case still breathes. It still moves through people. Inside the prosecutor's office, the case file was no longer marked inactive, no longer labeled unresolved, but it was not closed either. It sat in a liminal state, thick with addendums, annotations, post-confession analyses. The paper trail had doubled. What once documented absence now documented consequence. Every page carried weight, not because it was new, but because it reframed everything that came before it. Investigators assigned to review the confession began an uncomfortable task: revisiting failure. Not failure in the sense of negligence, but failure in the human sense. Moments when instinct had whispered one thing and procedure demanded another. Moments when resources were thin, when priorities collided, when the clock mattered more than the feeling in the gut. The solved cold case forced those moments back into the light. They noticed details that had once seemed trivial. A neighbor's statement dismissed as unreliable. A lead paused because it pointed nowhere fast. A person of interest who had seemed too ordinary to be dangerous. These were not mistakes unique to this case. They were patterns, repeated across decades of policing. The confession turned the Michigan 2002 cold case into a mirror. Training seminars referenced it quietly.
Note à spectacle.
As caution. As proof that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. That time does not validate assumptions, it only hardens them. Younger detectives listen closely, aware that one day, decades from now, their own decisions might be judged by people not yet born. The defense team, meanwhile, navigated a different psychological terrain. Confession cases carry a unique tension. The truth is spoken, yet strategy remains. Mitigation replaces denial. Context replaces contradiction. They examined the life that had unfolded between the crime and the confession: marriages, jobs, children, illnesses. They asked a question that feels almost taboo in the shadow of violence. Who is this person now? That question unsettled the public. The idea that someone capable of such an act could exist quietly among them for decades was harder to process than the crime itself. Evil, people want to believe, announces itself. It looks different. It feels different. The Michigan case challenged that belief brutally. Neighbors gave interviews, their voices tight, their sentences fractured. He waved. He helped shovel. He watched our dog. Each mundane detail felt accusatory in hindsight. Trust itself became suspect. The solved cold case did not just identify a perpetrator, it destabilized assumptions about normalcy. For the victim's family, Part 9 of this story was defined by something unexpected: silence of a different kind. Not the silence of unanswered questions, but the silence that follows confirmation. There were fewer calls. Fewer updates. The machinery of justice moved forward without their constant presence. For years, they had been orbiting the investigation. Now the investigation was moving past them. Grief resurfaced in strange forms. Not explosive, not dramatic. Subtle. A photograph glanced at too long. A song that suddenly felt heavier. Closure, they learned, is not a door that closes. It is a room you must learn how to live inside. They began to notice how the mystery had shaped their identities. How introductions often included the case. How sympathy had become a constant companion. Without the mystery, who were they to the world? A family whose tragedy had finally been acknowledged, but acknowledgement does not rebuild what was taken. Community vigils were held, quieter than before. Candles flickered, names were spoken, but there was no chant for justice this time. Justice had already arrived, late and imperfect. What remained was remembrance. The recognition that resolution does not restore the past, it reframes it. Media coverage shifted tone. The sharp edge dulled. Long-form articles replaced breaking news banners. Podcasts dissected timelines. Commentators debated ethics, psychology, systemic delay. The case transitioned from event to case study. From shock to substance. Yet even as analysis deepened, one question refused to settle: why had the confession happened when it did? Speculation multiplied. Some suggested guilt finally breached a failing mental dam. Others pointed to fear, of DNA, of genealogy databases, of technology tightening its net. A few whispered about control, about the power of choosing the moment of exposure. No explanation satisfied everyone. Perhaps because motive, like memory, degrades unevenly. The truth may have been singular, but the reasons were layered, eroded by time, reshaped by self-justification. The confession told what happened. It did not explain the human machinery behind it. In law enforcement circles, the Michigan 2002 cold case became shorthand.
Remembé Michigan.
It was invoked during evidence preservation debates, during funding hearings, during discussions about cold case units. It argued silently for patience, for investment, for faith in future tools not yet invented. The physical evidence, once static, now traveled. Laboratories requested access. Experts re-examined samples with fresh eyes. Not to prove guilt, that was established, but to test systems. To ensure the chain had held. To confirm that the science could withstand scrutiny. The case had become a benchmark. At the same time, the perpetrator's name, once unknown, now saturated records. Mugshots circulated. Biographies were assembled. Friends and relatives face their own interrogations, not by police, but by memory. Had there been signs? Had they missed something? The burden of association is heavy, even when innocence is unquestioned. Some cut ties. Some spoke publicly, defending the complexity of human behavior. Others retreated entirely, unwilling to become footnotes in a narrative they never chose. The solved cold case rippled outward, touching lives far removed from the original crime scene. Psychologists observed another phenomenon: delayed moral shock. People who had followed the case casually found themselves thinking about it weeks later, unprompted. In the shower. On long drives. Before sleep. The realization that truth can hide in plain sight for decades gnawed at something fundamental: the belief that the world, however cruel, is at least legible. The case undermined that belief. It suggested that reality is often opaque, that clarity is not guaranteed, that some answers arrive only after they have lost their power to change outcomes. That is a difficult truth to live with. As sentencing loomed, anticipation did not spike the way it does in fresh cases. There was no suspense about guilt. Instead, there was a collective holding of breath, not for the verdict, but for the emotional aftermath. What would justice feel like when it finally landed? Victim impact statements were prepared slowly, carefully. Each word weighed against decades of silence. Speakers rehearsed not to persuade, but to survive the act of speaking at all. The courtroom would hear not just anger, but time compressed into language. Outside, the seasons turned again.
Another winter. Another spring.
The case persisted, not as noise, but as presence. A solved cold case does not fade, it settles. It becomes part of the landscape, altering how future stories are understood. Part 9 of this saga is where certainty meets consequence. Where answers stop being abstract and start reshaping lives. The confession had cracked the door open. Now everyone involved was stepping through, carrying what they could, leaving behind what they must. Because the truth, once spoken, does not end a story. It demands that the story be lived differently from that moment on. The 10th movement begins on a morning that feels deceptively ordinary.
Grey Michigan light seep through courteous windows.
Fluorescent bulbs hum. Shoes echo against polished floors. This is the soundscape of consequence. Because this is where a cold case, once frozen in rumor and speculation, finally collides with the machinery built to assign weight, blame, and punishment. This is where decades of silence are forced into sentences. The courtroom fills slowly. Not with spectacle, but with gravity. Reporters take seats they've occupied before, their notebooks worn at the corners. Detectives enter without urgency, their expressions practiced, restrained. They have lived with this case for years longer than the public ever knew. Today is not triumph. It is completion of a task long delayed. The defendant is brought in last. Older now. Shoulders narrower. Movements careful. Time has done what time always does. It has softened the body without softening the past. The face that once blended into crowds now carries the permanent mark of recognition.
No mask. No anonymity.
Just a name attached to an act that refuses to age. There is no jury to convince. That work is already done. What remains is reckoning. The judge listens, eyes steady, aware that this case exists in multiple timelines at once. In one, the crime is fresh, raw, screaming for response. In another, it is archival, documented, historic. The challenge is to honor both without allowing either to dominate unfairly. The prosecutor speaks first. Not loudly. Not theatrically. The tone is deliberate, almost clinical. Dates are recited. Evidence summarized. The confession referenced not as drama, but as fact. Yet beneath the measured delivery, there is an undercurrent, a reminder that justice delayed does not erase harm, it compounds it. That the passage of time is not a mitigating factor for violence. Photographs are mentioned, though not displayed. Everyone in the room knows what they depict.
No one needs a remandé.
The power of this moment comes not from shock, but from inevitability. The cold case has traveled too far to turn back now. Then the defense rises. Their argument is not denial. That door closed the moment the confession was signed. Instead, they speak of context. Of mental state. Of a life lived quietly after the crime. Of years without further violence. They do not ask for absolution. They ask for proportion. They ask the court to acknowledge the human complexity that persists even in the presence of undeniable guilt. Some listeners bristle. Others nod reluctantly. This is the uncomfortable terrain of sentencing, the place where morality and legality overlap but never fully align. The law demands consistency.
Émotion de mon meaning.
The court must navigate both. Then come the voices that have waited the longest. The victim's family approaches the podium one by one. Hands tremble. Papers rustle. Words are chosen carefully, not to wound, but to survive being spoken aloud. They talk about birthdays missed. About chairs left empty. About decades spent explaining absence to strangers. They describe how the cold case became a shadow that followed every celebration, every loss, every milestone. One speaker pauses mid-sentence, breath-catching. The silence stretches. No one interrupts. This pause carries more weight than any prepared statement. It is the sound of grief refusing to be condensed into courtroom language. They speak of anger, yes, but also of exhaustion. Of how the confession brought answers, but not peace. Of how the solved cold case reopened wounds they had learned, imperfectly, to live with. They do not ask for vengeance. They ask for acknowledgement that what was taken cannot be returned, and that no sentence can rebalance the scale. When they finish, the room feels altered, as if the air itself has thickened. This is not closure.
This is confrontation.
The defendant is offered the chance to speak.
Arrête, not en obligation.
For a moment, it seems they might decline. Then they stand. Slowly. Words emerge haltingly, stripped of eloquence. An apology is offered. Not dramatic. Not persuasive. Simply stated. It lands unevenly. Some hear sincerity. Others hear strategy. Most hear something else entirely, the inadequacy of language in the face of irreversible harm. There is no forgiveness granted in that moment. None requested. The apology exists alone, suspended between past and present, unable to bridge the gap it acknowledges. The judge retires briefly. When they return, the decision is delivered with clarity. The sentence reflects the severity of the crime, the years elapsed, the confession's role. Each factor weighed. Each consideration articulated. The gavel falls not with force, but with finality. The Michigan 2002 cold case is no longer pending. It has crossed the threshold into history. Outside the courthouse, cameras capture reactions. Some family members decline to speak. Others offer brief statements, their voices steady but distant. Law enforcement officials express relief, gratitude, restraint. No one celebrates. Celebration feels inappropriate. What has occurred is resolution, not victory. As the crowd disperses, something subtle happens. The case begins to loosen its grip.
Not disappear.
Not fade, but shift.
It move from the present tense into the past perfect.
Something that happened. Something that has been addressed. The difference is small, but profound. For investigators, the aftermath brings an unfamiliar quiet. No more evidence to chase. No more theories to test. The file is closed, but the experience remains. They carry forward lessons etched deeply, about patience, about doubt, about the danger of certainty too early embraced. Some revisit old cases with renewed urgency. Others mentor younger officers differently now, emphasizing humility over confidence. The cold case has done more than deliver justice. It has reshaped perspective. For the community, the sentence triggers reflection. People reevaluate memories of the early 2000s. Where they were. What they believed. How the unresolved case had shaped local identity in ways they never fully recognized. The solved cold case becomes a reference point, a reminder that truth can arrive late, but still matter.
Média attention one. Headline shrink.
The story is replaced by newer crises, fresher tragedies. This is the cycle. But beneath the surface, the case continues to live, in training manuals, in academic papers, in conversations about forensic preservation and confession psychology. The physical locations tied to the crime remain unchanged. Streets still bear traffic. Houses still shelter families. Yet for those who know the story, these places carry invisible annotations. Memory overlays geography. The landscape remembers, even when it appears indifferent. The victim's name is spoken more gently now. Not as a question mark, but as a person whose story has been honored, if not healed. Memorials feel different when mystery is replaced by acknowledgement. Grief remains, but it has a shape. And the defendant begins a new chapter defined by confinement and reflection. The world they once navigated freely is now reduced to routine and restraint. Time, which once protected anonymity, now enforces accountability. The years ahead will be long. Longer, perhaps, than those already passed since the crime. Part 10 is not about answers. Those arrived earlier. It is about weight. About what happens when truth finally settles onto the shoulders of everyone involved. When a cold case solved stops being a headline and starts being a reality that must be lived with, day after day. Because resolution is not an ending. It is a transformation. And in Michigan, the silence that once surrounded this case has been replaced, not with noise, but with a deeper, heavier quiet.